Thanks for joining me for another review. This one is for the highly anticipated Storm Phaze 3. I've had a lot of success over the last year with my latest Phaze 2, so I just copy-pasted the layout, which is actually pretty weak. It's 5 1/4 pin to PAP with a 4 3/4 pin buffer. PSA to PAP doesn't matter on symmetrics, but it's 3 3/4 if you're curious. This puts the pin almost right underneath my bridge, shading a little bit more towards the ring finger side. This core is so rolling and continuous that despite the weakish numbers, it still does what it does, it just doesn't do it as strongly. And obviously the final result is still plenty strong for me. I've said before I don't need help out of a layout to make the ball hook, and this is Exhibit Z. The first word for this ball is just wow. It looks great, it smells great, the grapevine scent is like a stronger high road pearl, and on the lane it's everything you hoped for. The core and cover both individually have very recognizable features. It's both unmistakably Phaze 2 and Intense Fire at the same time. You can see Phaze 2 in the overall motion and shape, but you can see Intense Fire in the super clean and decisive reaction. This is the second time we've seen R3S Hybrid stateside. It was of course on the Intense Fire, but it's a cover I'm really familiar with and a huge fan of. I have 2 Fires and a Virtual Tour exclusive, which is an overseas ball, and the cover characteristics are stark and obvious to me. It's very clean up front, but the amount of boards it covers can be pretty shocking given how easily the ball glides down the lane. When it hits friction, it goes, but it doesn't burn energy and almost seems to make the ball accelerate on the back end. You can see flashes of R2S, but with R3S being a stronger formula, it handles oil better so the friction response doesn't force you left just to have it wiggle down lane because it's not getting enough traction. It has R2S level consistency in a stronger package across the board. As you can see as I move deeper, the Phaze 3 has a stunning amount of traction and drive here. It's a rare day when I can get in this far on a fresh shot and get wheels like this. If you're a regular viewer, you'll know that even boomy stuff isn't that boomy here, and stuff usually gets softer when I get in this far, but I might as well be a gauge right now. Speaking of gauge, let's head that direction. Like I've said in plenty of videos before, there's no shortage of shape here. Stuff is just gonna fly. My ProMotion looks like an Astrophysics here. The usual problem is finding the pocket and carrying consistently. It's almost sportish because of how strong the back ends are. You have to move inside to get length, but there's a point where you hit a cliff and the ball reaction starts getting a little late and sharp, so it can be a rough balance both getting length and an effective shape down lane without ringing 10s or sneaking high for 4s. Ball reaction always looks good, but that doesn't mean the pins are always going down. The Phaze 3 solves that problem for me. Obviously, it's too much ball from straighter. I had to do a lot of work just to get any shots even this far right. Once I started moving left, though, it opened up. The super clean cover just shoots the ball through the fronts, and it's continuous enough down lane that I can go ahead and still hit it to make it shape correctly, and maybe the biggest thing about it is that I can throw it further away from the pocket than literally anything else I use here to help with length without it standing up on the friction when it gets there. If I throw anything else this wide or with this kind of speed just straight right, it's either not going to make it back or just burn up trying to overcome the angle and the sharp friction. This ball almost seems to like it more the crazier the angles get. This core cover combo is just a perfect match in my mind, and honestly I do match up with both really well because they play to my strengths. If I get a windy, continuous core like Velocity inside of a super responsive cover like R3S Hybrid, that turns a lot of shots into cake for me. This cover seems to go an extra couple feet longer than you'd expect. It sits there for just a half second and then it takes off. What the ball is doing from the angles I'm playing is just silly. I mean, the revving up of the core and the drive from this steep of a ball path after getting such easy length is amazing. It's another one of those I'd show you more misses if I had them situations. But once I got left a third arrow, it was autopilot. Nearly everything was 10 back. We'll see how I feel about it in a couple months, of course, but sometimes you just know, and I knew before I put holes in it. It's a combination of my favorite cover and favorite core, and this time the bowling math actually does work out perfectly. The Phaze 3 releases on December 13th, so put it on your Christmas list. Thanks for watching. Thanks for joining me for another in-depth episode. This one is for the Phaze 3. This one's going to be a lot of fun, mostly because I love everything about this ball so much. I've been bugging Chad McLean, Storm's technical director, to put R3S Hybrid on really anything for the last year plus. The Intense Fire has been such an amazing ball for me, and the cover characteristics and the look it creates on the lane is just too impressive to ignore. It's super clean, super angular, very Pearl-like actually, so aside from being visually captivating, the results back all that up. Quite often you'll love the way something looks, it fits your eye for ball reaction, or you can see the potential with certain facets of reaction that make it look appealing, but that doesn't always translate to success. With the Phaze 3, I'm incredibly excited that everything comes together. Most better bowlers will tell you they like darker colors or a quieter looking blend so that they don't have bold flashy colors distracting them from seeing the ball roll. It's much easier to pick up on tiny ball reaction hiccups like when they see a small hook spot developing early in the lane and the ball seems to skip a bit, which is critical information. That's much harder to see with a ball that might be more colorful and better looking on the shelf, but the quote-unquote boring balls are the ones that are the most readable most of the time. Some color can help you read misses, like if you got up the back of it too much or if it's burning up on friction, and the Phaze 3 checks all those boxes extremely well. It's an incredibly attractive ball. The vibrant but not flashy colors give it a different look than anything else out there, so it will stand out on the shelf, but the blend and combination is so nice that you get readable feedback without being distracted. If you look closely, you can see the hand adjustments I've made or when I've just flat missed. From straighter, I'm much more up the back of it, and you can read by the color swirling up front what the ball is going to do down lane. And as I get deeper and more around the ball, there's a few that I missed and got too far behind, which resulted in the obvious reaction down lane of a flat or wrap 10, but I can instantly see what I did wrong by the color swirling if I didn't quite feel what I did at release. But it's not so bright and loud that it's distracting me from reading the reaction. It's actually helping. The velocity core creates a very familiar shape throughout the lane. It's tumbling, it's rolling, it's revving, it just wants to go, but being symmetric, it's not overpowering. I imagine most of you out there have or have had a Phaze 2 at some point. It's one of the best the company has ever made, period. They're on TV all the time. It's actually odd to see Chris Prather using anything else. It's a staple or a must-have ball in every single pro staffer's bag, and for anyone who bowls tournaments, I can't imagine not having one. That just seems to me like giving money away. The original Phaze was a bit of a quandary. They used a really different cover on it, which was pearl, but really smooth, almost like what you'd expect a Pearl Crux Prime to act like. I had two myself and just made a deal for a third one. I really liked it, but it wasn't what people think when they think pearl. It was an effective reaction that just wasn't an impressive one from an optics standpoint, and it just didn't look like a traditional reaction, so the reception was mixed. People were initially hesitant about the Phaze 2 because of that, but have obviously been won over. The combination of the clean and quick R3S hybrid cover with this windy continuous core creates that wow factor and instant recognition of the look and shape that people always visualize when they're thinking pearl. They want skid, they want snap, they want power, and the Phaze 3 brings all of that. Naturally, the other side of the coin with a super responsive ball is that it's going to flat move, and when friction shows up, you're going to know about it. It's not going to give you as much warning as other balls will naturally, so while more experienced bowlers will understand that it needs a little bit more aggressive move schedule, less experienced bowlers who don't make moves until the ball jumps or forces them to might get some surprises because of how sharply this ball responds to friction. However, this is a longer and stronger Phaze 2. The strength and dominance of the core harnesses the power of the cover well. With quick covers, sometimes you get an early read, but when you go to move left, it goes too long and gets flat. Not the case at all with the Phaze 3. It just keeps coming, and despite the shine, it's strong enough to get traction earlier, and the revving of the core helps it to stabilize in the mid lane so that the cover can dig in and suck the pins back into the pit. The Phaze 3 is everything I expected and hoped it would be, and as the cover breaks in and the friction response tames down a little bit, I can only imagine it'll get better. Thanks for watching. Thanks for joining me for another video, and instead of this ball versus that ball, the P2 and P3 are pretty obvious companions, and while the similarities and the way they complement each other makes for a short and easy list, we'll go down a side road and get into the applications and options these two as a pair give you. As I've mentioned on the other videos, the velocity core they share is rolly, revving, and aggressively continuous. As it winds up, it continues to gain momentum, which gives you a wide range of uses and offers quite a bit of physical versatility despite the strong personality of the core. Because it's so strong and consistent, it offers you a multitude of ways to harness it instead of control and manipulate it like you can with more pliable balls like the Rotogrip Wild Streak. So obviously these two are windy and continuous due to the velocity core, which creates a familiar and obviously similar motion on the lane, but that's delivered in quite different ways by the traction and friction response characteristics of the two. TX16 that's on the Phaze 2 is early and smooth, R3S Hybrid that's on the Phaze 3 is super clean and quick. Between these two balls, I have the absolute widest range of lane coverage out of maybe any other ball combination out there. The windy nature of the core means I can get straight and zip it down the lane without having to try and shape it myself. The slow nature of the P2 cover is going to help minimize the bounce on friction to help keep it on line and from moving too soon, but the core is going to help it wind up and turn so I can be nicer to it at the bottom. Once I get to about 4th arrow, the slower nature of the cover starts to lose some pocket presence despite still having the ball motion to get back up to it. This is where the quicker nature of the Phaze 3 comes into play. I'm still getting the windy aggression of the core, but the friction response helps it boom back. The friction response makes it more sensitive the further right I get, but it makes it more powerful the deeper I get because the cover is so clean that it's not using or burning anything until it hits friction, so it has all that energy focused into moving on the back end. The revving of the core is what helps stabilize it, so it's not using much, if any, of that energy to change direction, so it all goes into response and movement. The Phaze 2, by contrast, is able to have an earlier and smoother cover because the core is helping it shape and move. This gives you the ability to both shape it more if you want, or to ease out of it and let the natural tendencies take over more. As far as a direct ball-to-ball comparison, I still feel that the Phaze 2 is the more versatile ball of the two, at box surface at least. Similar surfaces would likely bring them closer, but the cover differences would still lean them in the same directions, just not quite as far. At the same time, that's like saying one ball is slightly less versatile than quite possibly the most versatile ball out there, period. So the level of versatility versus the benchmark for the Phaze 3 is still pretty outstanding and higher than most. Time will tell if it's an even better combination than my Phaze 2 and Idle Pearl have been, but it's definitely not worse, just different. Thanks for watching. Thanks for joining me for another video. This one is a comparison between the Phaze 3 and 2 intense fires with different layouts. My Phaze 3 layout is 5 1/4 by 3 3/4 by 4 3/4. My first intense fire layout is 5 1/4 by 5 by 2 3/4, and my second one is 5 1/4 by 3 1/2 by 4 1/2. So the same pin to pap for all, but the Phaze 3 and second fire are pinned down while the first fire is pin up, and we'll see how different the PSA to pap and pin buffer measurements make them. The Intense Fire was the first stateside ball to feature R3S Hybrid, which is basically R2S enhanced. More traction, quicker response, etc. The Rad E core from the Fire was also in the original Intense, and the two Intense balls met an interesting reception. The Rad E core revs super quickly when it hits friction. It's most visible on my second Fire, but R3S is interesting in that the Pearl version is somehow smoother than the hybrid version. It's a bit slower on friction, so the Intense always reminded me of a hybrid type reaction, or the type of reaction that I normally need to find a hybrid cover to fit. And the Fire has always reminded me of a Pearl, super clean, very responsive down lane, and it almost seems to accelerate on the back end. For most people though, both Intense releases seem to be either too much or too little, and with as quick revving as the core is and as strong and quick as the cover formula is, that resulted in some pretty layout sensitive balls in my opinion. I featured both Fires in my latest Essentials collection videos. They both have very defined differences and much different purposes in my bags. Layouts are quite a bit more important and can create greater differences on asymmetric balls because of the additional imbalance you can create. My first Fire is the one that I featured in my original review a year and a half ago. It's pin up, and let's get into the full layout. At 5 1/4, the pin to pat measurement stands the core up more, so it's rolling more top over bottom or end over end, which will get it easier length and make it more forward rolling off the end of the pattern or make it want to straighten out more. At 5 inches, the PSA to pat measurement is also pretty weak and more forward rolling. It turns the core horizontally to the point that there's very little imbalance there either, so I've mitigated the aggression of the core quite a bit. At 2 3/4, the pin buffer measurement still makes the layout pin up, which does lower the RG a bit and raise the differential because I'm taking weight more out of the side of the core, which in effect makes it not as wide and creates a greater difference between the width and the height of the core. So the result is that I've got a longer and more forward rolling biased layout, but still with some pop down lane, and that's obvious in the reaction. It's great for when I need to keep my angles closed but need some extra firmness down lane that I can't get out of a symmetric ball like, say, the Idle Pearl. You can see that when I start to get deeper, it doesn't really want to. It's pretty relegated to the zones right of third arrow unless I really help it. Moving on to Fire number 2, we've got a fairly different story here obviously, and there's absolutely zero overlap any way you look at it. The pin to pap is the same at 5 1/4, so again, core is fairly straight up and down. The PSA to PAP measurement is quite a bit stronger at 3.5. This turns the core horizontally at nearly a 45-degree angle and takes almost full advantage of the asymmetry, which makes it rev up very strongly down lane. The pin buffer is quite a bit weaker at 4.5. That moves it into pin down territory, where the weight removed from drilling the fingers takes more out of the top of the core, which shortens it and raises the RG and decreases the differential. With such a strong PSA to PAP measurement, I didn't need to add any more to it. With as quick and responsive as the cover is, like we've discussed, I didn't need something winding up and then going insane down lane. I wanted churning and revving without overkill on the back end aggression or a cutting finish. The end result is that you can see that this fire doesn't like playing right. I can force it to if I really want to, but that's covered by my first fire. At third arrow, where my first fire begins to get longer and softer, that's where my second one starts warming up and getting comfortable. It's quite a bit quicker revving. You can see how even here I kind of have to lay out of it with my hand, because as it gets to the end of the pattern, it picks up and revs quite quickly. Now as I get deeper, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. The strong and quick revving of the core with a decisive but not overpowering move on the back end. It's a reaction that gets me back from the deeper zones on the lane while being effective at the same time. It's fun to watch a ball boom, but the name of the game is scoring, and too much boom isn't usually helpphul. Now we visit the Phaze 3, and here we can see the difference the asymmetric versus symmetric core creates because they have the same cover. Nearly identical layouts, same pin to PAP, and only a 1/4 inch different in pin buffer, which is negligible. PSA to PAP doesn't come into play on a Phaze 3 at all because there's no horizontal asymmetry in the core. It's like turning a pop can one way or the other. The width of the can is still the same all the way around, so there's no asymmetry there to create additional imbalance. The result is that the core doesn't rev up as much on its own. It allows me to do more of the revving myself. It's not quite as powerful, so I can go ahead and get all of it at the bottom that I want, where with the second fire, I need a fair amount more oil to let me get away with that. At the same time, the second fire doesn't need quite as much out of me. It does more of the work on its own, but the flip side of that is that I don't have as much control over what it does, and it can be hard to adjust mechanics to just slow down your rev rate. If I want the Phaze 3 to slow down a little, I can back out of it and slow it down. Now with the second fire, I'm not sure I've ever given it the business at the bottom. It's plenty strong at about 75% from me. The result is two very similar zones of play, but the second fire is still an appreciable amount stronger than the P3, so the use for each will depend on the length and volume of the pattern, as well as the amount of lane surface friction, while the first fire shares nothing at all in common with either the second or the P3 from a reaction standpoint. Thanks for watching. Thanks for joining me for the final video of my Phaze 3 release series, the Phaze 3 versus the Astrophysics. I've been going pin down on most of my balls recently, and the Astro is no different, save for a pin to PAP adjustment. With it having a weaker cover in R2S Pearl than the other ASIMs in either line, I wanted to strengthen the layout a bit to make up for that, so instead of 5 1/4 by 3.5 by 4.5, the Astro was 4 5/8 by 3.5 by 4.5. So while the other asymmetric balls I've been comparing the P3 to have had stronger covers or the same cover with a very similar layout, the Astro has a weaker cover but stronger layout, which I don't quite think offsets the cover difference, but it does put the Astro in a place that differentiates the overall reaction and its relationship to both the Phaze 3 and balls like the Halo Pearl and Intense Fire. The atomic core in the Astro has a lot of torque down lane. It's very firm and decisive at the breakpoint. It doesn't rev up quite as quick down lane as the Rad E from the Intense Fire, and it's not more forward rolling like the Centrum in the Halo Pearl. It does very closely resemble the Velocity core in the Phaze series on the lane though. Velocity has that windy climbing and aggressively continuous motion, and Atomic shares that description just with additional asymmetric torque, which basically just makes the overall motion stronger. This is very easy to see in the original physics that shares a very phase-like ball motion, and additionally in the Astro, with the twist provided there by the cover. R2S Pearl is a medium-strength cover, and it balances out the aggression of the core and fits well as a complement to the physics. Any stronger of a cover and it wouldn't have created enough separation there. Where this gets interesting though is in the cover disparity between the Astro and Phaze 3. So on one hand, the atomic core is stronger than Velocity, but the other, R3S Hybrid, is definitely stronger than R2S Pearl, which puts the Astro and P3 into really similar territory. The Astro is more core dominant, and I'd say the Phaze 3 is right in balance with cover and core sharing equal amounts of the workload. Now this ultimately makes the Astro early rolling, but still longer and smoother than the Phaze 3. I think the cover strength with the Phaze 3 makes up for the core difference and then some. Now when we take a look at the physics again, it comes across as more familiar to the Phaze 3 from an on-lane perspective as far as shape goes, but with the greater strength of both cover and core in the physics, that separates it from the P3 more firmly and puts them into a solid complement category rather than a comparison category. I know they look similar in strength here, but given a higher volume condition or something more appropriate for the physics from a hook potential standpoint, that's where you'd see the greater degree of separation. The P3 is definitely quicker down lane than the Astro and even a bit stronger as far as total board coverage. The Astro will be better in situations where you need more mid lane or more mid lane control, but with a firm and easily controllable shape down lane. Maybe when the back ends are tight but there's not enough volume to get a stronger cover down the lane, something like that. The P3 will be better at opening the lane up. It's not going to be in play when the back ends are tighter, definitely too much boom down lane, but it handles angle quite a bit better than the Astro, which just doesn't quite have enough cover traction from deep without a solid amount of friction to work with, or possibly adding surface, but in that case you end up changing the shape too. This fits the Astro into a zone further right of the P3, kind of halfway between the Halo Pearl and my first fire, pretty well solidly third arrow given a benchmark condition, but the weaker cover takes it a little sideways into some different applications from the others. Too much friction makes the Halo Pearl burn up and straighten out even more, it forces me really deep with the Phaze 3, and it makes the fire just too early, but that's where the Astro is at home. It's a stronger ball look and motion that reaches a bit further down or that you can stick with longer than the other shiny ASIMs. It can't hang with the P3 on more volume though, and in my opinion anyway, this makes the Phaze 3 a more versatile ball on the fresh, and with as far left as the P3 lets me get, the Astro won't come out of the bag until I just can't get the P3 down the lane, which just may not happen unless it's a really long format. So despite the Astro being asymmetric due to the cover strength, it's actually a ball down from my Phaze 3. I hope you've enjoyed my Phaze 3 release series. It's been a ton of fun to make. Thanks for watching. Thanks for joining me for another video. This one is for the Phaze 3 versus the Halo Pearl. There are a few different reasons to do ball comparisons. One is to find good complements in one way or another, whether they be shape differences or hook differences that can work together in tandem to offer you versatility, or to take a look at two outwardly similar balls like the Phaze 3 and Halo Pearl to find what separates them and to understand the difference and applications for each. At surface value, there's not a ton of difference visually between the Phaze 3 and Halo Pearl. On paper, the Phaze 3 is a hybrid symmetric, the HP is a Pearl ASIM, but when you look at the two side by side on the lane, it's hard to find many differences without looking closely. We'll talk about the similarities, but we'll also dive into the key differences that separate them rather distinctly. First, we'll cancel out the cover differences. I've always said R3S Hybrid acts more like a Pearl. Somehow it's cleaner up front and much more responsive down lane than R3S Pearl is, so visibly it looks a lot like the E-Trax Pearl from the Halo Pearl and Idol Pearl. Super easy length, very clean up front, so they have similar lengths, similar friction response, and for these two particular balls, similar hook potentials. They're uncomfortable for me from straighter angles because of how close that puts me to the friction on a house shot, but it's still playable out there with a few adjustments. The deeper I get, the more the reaction can breathe and the more they open up the pattern, but up to a point. I've got very similar layouts on them, 5 1/4 by 3 3/4 by 4 3/4 on the Phaze 3, 5 1/4 by 3 1/2 by 4 1/2 on the Halo Pearl, the huge difference being the ASIM core in the Halo Pearl. Weak and more forward rolling pin position on both, but while the second number for the Phaze 3 means literally nothing, the second number being PSA to pat measurement for the Halo Pearl means a lot, especially considering it's a pretty strong number. The pin buffer length moves them both into pin down territory for me, which raises the RG and lowers the differential of the core. This weakens the Phaze 3 a fair amount, while the strong PSA to pat measurement helps to offset and mitigate the weakness of the pin to pap and pin buffer numbers on the Halo Pearl. Instead of strong on top of strong, it's a nice balance and creates more controllable strength further down the lane where I want and need it. Theoretically, this should deliver a larger difference than we're seeing here, but the main key difference is shape down lane that the core creates. Velocity in the Phaze 3 is a rolly, revving, and aggressively continuous core. As it hooks, it continues to wind up and gain momentum, and when combined with the clean, strong, and quick R3S hybrid cover, you end up with a relentless reaction down lane without the overkill of extra torque you'd see with an asymmetric core. With the Halo Pearl, the Centrum core is much more forward down lane, so while you have the extra torque from the asymmetric core, you also have a balance there that keeps it from being as excessive as the math might indicate. This results in a sweet spot of about 3rd to 4th arrow on really anything for me with the Halo Pearl. Any further right and the friction response for me causes over-under, and any further left and the forward rolling bias of the core makes me have to change too much physically for it to be as effective as I'd like. It sounds like a small zone of optimal use, but it's really not when you consider how lethal it is there and how large of an area that still is. The Phaze 3 also creates some difficulty from straighter because while I can back out of the Halo Pearl and at least get it to stop down lane, the Phaze 3 doesn't want to, it keeps coming. Its sweet spot starts at about 3rd arrow but doesn't really liven up until I'm at 4th arrow and deeper. With as persistent and determined as the core is to hunt down the 7-pin, it feeds on big angle, and with as responsive as this cover is down lane, it needs that angle to produce the best results and to balance its natural tendencies. Now, I'm not saying this takes it out of play for straighter bowlers at all. In fact, it should create the most visually dynamic reaction for you out of anything else out there. But again, I don't need all that extra help for ball motion. What it does, though, is give me a deep zone look that I have with nothing else aside from perhaps the Phaze 2, but due to the stronger, smoother, and earlier cover, there are occasions when it creates the motion I need from deep, but not the shape on the back end. The Phaze 3 gives me a look from the nosebleed zones on the lane that I have with literally nothing else, and it gives it to me before the lanes are destroyed enough to force me there. It lets me get ahead of the transition instead of making me dependent on it. So despite similar surface value optics, the Halo Pearl and Phaze 3 end up having a bit of overlap from the 3rd to 4th arrow zone, but they have pretty different applications for me which are dependent on the details of the conditions. Thanks for watching. Thanks for joining me for another video. This one is for the Phaze 3 versus the Idle Pearl. So I've already described the Phaze 3 at length over several videos now, but of course I'll hit the high points if this is the first one you're watching. This comparison is probably the most logical one so far and the one that draws the most questions or needs the closest look because of the overwhelming similarities on paper. First of all, these two balls are drilled the same. 5 1/4 pin to PAP, 4 3/4 pin buffer. The P3's velocity core is 2.48 RG, 051 differential, and the Idle Pearl's Icon core is 2.49 RG and 052 differential, so shades different. 1/100th of a difference in RG and 1,000th in differential. The shapes visually show a bit of design difference, but ultimately and for all intents and purposes, the differences are negligible. On the lane they have similar motions, rolly, fast revving, and continuous. The difference in covers put on each core so far have created an appreciable difference or an appropriate amount of separation between them. The first phase was a Pearl, but with opposite descriptions of the clean and quick E-Trax P18 Pearl cover on the Idle Pearl. AX16 was pretty early and smooth, and not just for a Pearl, but pretty early and smooth period. TX16 on the Phaze 2 is right between the Microtrax S18 solid on the Idle and E-Trax S19 solid on the Idle Pro. TX16 isn't as early and smooth as the Idle cover and not as long and strong as the Idle Pro cover. Now, however, we have the Phaze 3, which shares nearly identical descriptions with the Idle Pearl aside from being a hybrid version of the R3S formula. Like I've said though, R3S Hybrid has very traditionally Pearl-like descriptions and attributes. When I think or envision a traditional Pearl reaction, something really clean up front and quick on friction, R3S Hybrid is included or naturally comes to mind. If we cancel out the descriptors and look at the results, the Phaze 3 and Idle Pearl become stunningly similar. Every single description detail for each ball is shared by the other. However, I think you can tell by now that on the lane the math doesn't add up to terribly similar results. As I've said before, my Phaze 2 and Idle Pearl combination has been unbeatable for me for nearly a year now. The big difference here is that the Idle Pearl is the ball down or zone right complement to my Phaze 2, while the Phaze 3 is the lateral hook potential complement but zone left to the Phaze 2. The difference here to me is obviously just down to cover formula strength. R3S for me is a more exaggerated version of R2S, same attributes just enhanced, so stronger and quicker. E-Trax feels like a similar comparison. It's also stronger and quicker than R2S, so the attributes or the descriptions of those attributes mirror those of the R3S, just not to the same degree when it comes to actual strength or hook potential. The Idle Pearl obviously won't be going anywhere, but the Phaze 3 was a reaction I was lacking. My pin down intense fire has been filling that slot, but with the extra torque from the asymmetric core, that makes it too strong for most regular use. The P3 is the same idea, but just in a much more usable window. If you have an idle pearl and were worried about potential overlap with the Phaze 3, I think it's pretty obvious that you really don't have to be. The zones that each ball favor for me have little to no overlap. Much right of third arrow and the P3 is too much ball, and much left of third arrow and the idle pearl isn't enough without a fair amount of friction, and at that point I'm likely already in the Phaze 3 and arrow deeper where I don't have to play the friction so heavily. Thanks for watching.
Ah.